You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan. Happy Thanksgiving to all of you in the United States. This episode is coming out a little bit early so that it can be available for the full Thanksgiving holiday. There is a turkey dry brining feet away from me as I speak. Thanksgiving preparations are very much underway in my household, so I'll keep this little introduction brief. I will just pause first to note that I am so thankful this Thanksgiving for all of you. My beloved and sorely missed former co-host and co-creator of this podcast, Catherine Brobeck, passed away around this time of year 2 years ago, and I can't help feeling extra grateful around this time of year for the support and affection of all of you. It is very much felt and very much appreciated. On that note, I don't often make the request for ratings and or reviews until the very end of each episode, at which point I'm sure many of you have stopped listening. So I'd just like to put out a general call here. If you haven't yet given the podcast a rating, I'm not even going to ask for a review because a review takes a little bit more time. Leave a review by all means if you would like to, but a rating is a pretty quick affair and it's something that really helps the podcast out. So if you have not yet rated this podcast and you are thankful, even in any small way, for this podcast in your life, I would ask you to just take a moment and rate the podcast right now. It doesn't cost anything. It's a relatively painless procedure. And the more ratings the podcast gets, the wider its reach becomes. I know not all of you are listening to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, but we are at about 820 ratings, and I would love to be able to get up to, or at least close to 1,000 ratings by the end of the year. That is my personal goal. So you might hear me talk about this in a near future episode. I'll try not to spend too much time on it. I feel like I'm one of those annoying commentators on PBS or NPR who harangue viewers and listeners for money, donations around this time of year. But again, I'm not asking you for money. This is not a pledge drive. This is a mini ratings drive. Just take a moment and give the podcast a rating if you've listened to it and you haven't yet done so. You know who you are. Thank you in advance. I really appreciate that lovely Thanksgiving gift from you. All right. I have a fantastic interview episode for you. This is the next installment in my All About Agatha Christie and the Theater series. And if you're a fan of the Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and I would wager you are, I think you're really going to love this conversation that I had with the playwright and theater director, Mark Shanahan. Let's get to it. Mark Shanahan is a New York-based theater artist whose work has been seen on and off Broadway, internationally, and at numerous regional stages across the United States. He is the writer-director of the New York Times critics' pick, A Sherlock Carol, which, as you might be able to guess from the title, is a mashup of Conan Doyle and Dickens. I love that. I need to see that at some point in my life for sure. He is the author of numerous other plays performed both on the stage and radio. He has directed at so many theaters that I'm not going to try to list them now because if I did, we would be here all day. But suffice to say that one of them is the Alley Theater in Houston, Texas, where his latest play is currently running. More on that in just a moment. Mark was recently announced as the incoming artistic director for the historic Westport Country Playhouse in Westport, Connecticut, and he is proud to participate each year as the writer-director of the annual gala for the Hole in the Wall Gang Camp, a summer camp founded by Paul Newman to serve seriously ill children and their families. Welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Thank you, Kemper. I'm glad to be here.
So the new play that you wrote, Mark, and directed, which is currently up at the Alley Theater in Houston, Texas, is none other than an adaptation of Agatha Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. I obviously have a number of questions about this, but there's one point that I want you to clarify from the start. This adaptation of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd has been officially sanctioned by Agatha Christie's estate, Agatha Christie Limited. They actually granted Mark a license to put on this play. And in a previous episode with Christie theater expert Julius Green, Julius touched very briefly on the fact that the licensing of Christie titles for theatrical adaptation is not something that happens these days as often as it used to. The estate has gotten a bit pickier as to who might receive a license to adapt Agatha Christie's work. So, Mark, before we get into the play itself and your regard for Christie, could you tell us a little bit about how you came to adapt The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, including the licensing process that you went through with the estate?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I appreciate that question because it has meant quite a bit to me to have that relationship with the estate and Agatha Christie Limited, and also to not only have their blessing, but to start a relationship with them in which they appreciated what I was after and trying to honor the book. And it felt, it's as close as you can come to having the author herself over your shoulder trying to grant you a blessing. And it meant a great deal to me.
Absolutely.
I have been, although, as you say, I'm a New York-based theater artist, I have had a long association with the Alley Theater in Houston, Texas, which is one of our nation's premier regional theaters. It is really one of the jewels of regional theaters. And every summer they have a series called the Summer Chills series, which originally had been started to just keep the actors employed in their resident company in the summer and take some flats and put up a set quickly and see what they could do. And it very quickly was clear to them that if they put on a mystery in the Summer Chill series, that people flocked to, and offering a different audience that sometimes went during the course of the regular season. It's an nearly 800 seat house, a beautifully renovated, recently renovated theater that has been around for nearly 70 years, but the current location has been around since the 1960s, and it's big, imposing for sort of brutalist architecture. And I have loved going down and being what one of the resident company members is called a kissing cousin, because there is a resident company of actors, one of the last great resident companies to exist with a major theater. And they would often job in certain actors and different artists and directors to come in and work with them. And I've had a great joy of being associated with the company for about 19 years now. And part of that is I've come in to direct and act in some of their Summer Chill series. In particular, I was acting in Witness for the Prosecution. I've acted in The Hollow. I've done some of the Sherlock Holmes stories. And I love them because I know the audience comes to them. And some years ago, I said to the artistic director, what if after the renovation, you not only had your new theater, but we had a new Christie for a new adaptation? Could you approach the estate? Mm-hmm. And it became clear that, I understood that the estate rightly sort of guards the legacy of the brand and the name itself of Agatha Christie very seriously, as well they should. And when it was proposed to them to do The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which was the book I wanted to do, I was told, well, they think it's too hard. They think that it can't be done. They think for various reasons a novel, it wouldn't. What other ones are there? And in a fit of, I'm going to say, creativity or desire, I sat down and I wrote 15 pages and I tried to pitch it in the way I thought it could do it. And then I actually thought, I'd better finish this up before I forget what my ideas are here on how to do this. So I wrote a draft of it. And then the theater had to go through its renovation, and there was a storm, a hurricane that shut them down. A lot of things happened, and I kind of put it in the back of my mind. And eventually, the theater showed it to the Christie estate, and there was a real reception to it, which I'm glad to say came through. I had been told that they had a number of attempts at adapting The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and thought it wasn't to their liking. And Julia Wilde, who works at the Christie Estate in acquisitions and other media, told me that she and some other members of the team read it on a transatlantic flight. When they got off the plane, they each said to each other, well, that one works. Let's go ahead with that one. And I received their go-ahead and their blessing. So when I was eventually invited to direct my own adaptation of it at the theater, it was with a great sense of joy of returning not only to the Alley to do a brand new adaptation of a Christie for their series of Summer Chills, but also with the blessing of the estate.
Wow. Well, okay. We're just going to go ahead and get a little spoilery here for a moment. I know that's something,
we have to, but I kind of hate to.
Yeah, it's okay. We do this from time to time on the podcast. I'm going to go ahead and warn anyone who hasn't yet read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd that they may want to pause this episode here and either fast forward a number of minutes, I'd say like 5-10 minutes, or if you're really worried, just go and read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd before continuing, because
I say either way. Either way, go read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. It's one of the great joys in life. You know?
It really is. No, I mean, truly one of the tip-top Christie crown jewels, our third ranked Christie title on the podcast. Right. And so the Murder of Roger Ackroyd, one of the reasons I think that it is one of the crown jewels is that it contains such an ingenious and in particular ingeniously executed trick of Christie's, which is that spoiler, the narrator did it.
It's too late. Now you said it.
Now I've said it. But for this very reason, and this is really what you were, so dancing around, because you were much more considerate than I am, and I just went ahead and spoiled the whole thing. But that is why the novel has a reputation for being unadaptable into any other medium, especially a visual one like a play. So to the extent that you're comfortable talking about it, I just have to ask you pretty baldly here, Mark, how did you get around that problem? Because I cannot imagine myself how a theatrical adaptation of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd would work.
So, Kemper, nobody sent you the play to read, which is good, because now I can pump it up and make it. But I will send you a copy of it if you'd like to read it.
I would love. Please do.
I think, but I'm glad to talk about it, because I'm so used to now giving interviews where I mention everything other than why I really love it. Love the book so much that I don't even, I feel weird to even talk about the spoiler, because there is some kind of level of hell reserved for people who look to the last page of a Christie or talk about it in the lobby at intermission, that if they've seen the play already. And I always kind of blanch at those things. So here we are talking about the spoiler itself. I'll tell you in short, listen, when I was a teenager, like so many people, I came across at a yard sale a cardboard box full of paperbacks of Christie's, and I bought them all and I poured through them, and it changed me. I just absolutely loved it. And I've loved the books ever since. But chief among them was The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. I distinctly remember gasping at the end out loud while reading it. That doesn't happen often when you read a book. Yeah. And then feeling I had been taken on this incredible ride, and I did not understand the world I had invested myself in, because things were not what they seemed to be. That the narrator, Dr. Shepard, who I had trusted as my narrator, as if he were Dr. Watson in a home story, turned out to be not only misleading, but someone I couldn't trust. And it actually is one of the reasons I think the book scares me a little bit too. It not only is thrilling, but it gives me a little chill to think things are not what they seem, and those who you trust might not be trustworthy. And I think there's something really wonderful buried in the novel because of that. And I remember going back to the first page right away, and trying to reread it, look for a flaw, look for a place where Dr. Shepard had not played fair with me. And I couldn't. And I've gone back to that book so many times to study it and to see the marvelous construction of it. So many of the Christie plays, which I admire so much and I worked on, and making a life in the theater, I've had such joy working on a Christie play. They work you over, and they work an audience over. And I really wanted to figure out how The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which is a piece of prose, a piece of fiction that works itself on its audience as a reader in very particular ways, might also be able to work over an audience. I thought, although a lot of it is set at Fernley Park in the book, we call it Fernley Hall in the play. Although a lot of it is set at Fernley, there are other locations, Dr. Shepard's home. There are phone calls that are made. There's the Three Boars pub down at in the town. And I wanted to do something that felt sort of uniquely theatrical, where we could with a turn of a chair, suddenly say we are somewhere else, with a narrator who guides us through a story and becomes an audience's best friend, and then turn the tables on that audience and that relationship with their narrator. I mean, if the granddaddy of all narrator plays feels like The Glass Menagerie, right? That memory play in and of itself that changes the world when it's put out. And you always do, from the first line, feel as if you've been invited to experience the story because the narrator has offered to take you on this trip. And I thought there must be a way in which Dr. Shepard could engage the trust of a room full of people as if he is their friend. And then we could give ourselves that chill I felt while reading the book, that the person that you've enjoyed that person's company all night turned out to be someone you shouldn't have trusted. And the thing that, Kemper, that I've loved so much in Disc, I didn't know if it would work. I was really hopeful it would work, but you wonder if, when it's not a piece of writing, will we tip our hand too much? Will the performance tip its hand? Will the omission of certain facts be too obvious on a stage? But the week before I went down to Houston, we gave it a read at the Westport Country Playhouse with an all-star cast of Broadway notables like Santino Fontana and Christine Nielsen and Alan Gilmore and Isabel Keating, these wonderful, wonderful Broadway actors. And the place was filled. And the moment Dr. Shepard was revealed as the killer, the audience gasped. And I felt happier than I've ever felt in my life. And a week later, we went down, I started rehearsal, and I thought, I wonder if we can get that back in a production. And on the first preview, when Poirot kicks Dr. Shepard's bag across the stage and says, "That person was you," and the audience gasped, I thought, man, it's the best sound I've ever heard. I've been chasing sounds like that working in the theater my whole life. To have 700 people sitting there and gasp all in one, it just felt fantastic. And I think the play has a theatrical bent because the book is a little theatrical in itself, with colorful characters and a fast-moving plot. And it's just been such a joy to see these characters I love from a book traipse onto the stage and become flesh and become real in the hands of wonderful actors.
I love that. I mean, it's you became the one inducing the gasp. It's a full circle moment, right? Like
yeah. But did I really? I mean, let's be honest. Like I'm an adapter has to service the piece. The genius of this whole thing is Agatha Christie. There's no doubt about that, right? And so what I'm trying to do is become this sort of delivery system for something I loved and try and give it to people the way it affected me because I loved it as a reader, and say, how many people can I help bring this to, and bring her to, so that she is, she's honored, because, the book has had a hard history of attempts at adaptation, which we can also talk about. But I really wanted the book to be honored in this way, but also be a play, because we're also not only dealing, as you said, with the Julius Green wonderful interview. It said, the opening line of his book, this is a book about the greatest playwright in history. She also wrote some books. She was an incredible playwright. So it's very hard to know that you're up against someone not only to honor her book, but to know that she also understood the construction of theater and how to work over an audience as well.
Right. Is it it also, when you were talking about then the role of Dr. Shepard as narrator on the stage, is there a bit of a parallel to the stage manager in Our Town? That's just something that popped into my head as well. Yes. Is that fair?
Yeah, I love that you think of that when you think of a narrator. I mean, there are quite a lot of great, wonderful plays in which narrators invite the audiences along. And I have loved, Mr. Newman's production of Our Town, which I saw when it was on Broadway. It started at Westport Country Playhouse, was just incredibly moving. And I've loved that play. There is a wonderful sense of theatricality, not to give exposition through a narrator, but to invite an audience along or a way into the story when you use a narrator correctly. Yeah, that to me is like the ultimate. I don't know. There's something foundational, I think, in for American audiences about Our Town. It's just you come across it. I think it was actually featured in an episode of The Wonder Years. That's how. Oh yeah, I think I remember that. Yeah,
right.
Well, it's like Thornton Wilder. Yeah, they always say, "Oh, Our Town's done at high schools and things like that." Okay, sure. But Thornton Wilder also wrote a very dark, beautiful. Like, what is Our Town? What is it? And at the beginning of Roger Ackroyd, Dr. Shepard talks about King's Abbot as being a place filled with old ladies and military men, and our chief hobby is gossip. And what you find in King's Abbot is that this pristine little English town also has some darker things going on beneath it. And when you look a little further, it's not for nothing, Thornton Wilder is credited as one of the screenwriters on Alfred Hitchcock's wonderful movie Shadow of a Doubt, in which Joseph Cotten gives that beautiful speech about pulling back the white picket fences and finding out what's inside the walls of these pristine little houses in this California town. And it often does feel chilling to look at something that seems beautiful and find out that there's something darker going on underneath it. And that's what's happening in Roger Ackroyd.
Yeah, Shadow of a Doubt and Our Town, actually, both Catherine Brobeck favorites, actually.
Oh, good.
She would have been so into this conversation, for sure. I know, that's brilliant. I mean, it's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by way of Our Town. Like, I'm in. That's really interesting. It makes sense. That makes sense to me.
The opening of the book is so great. Mrs. Ferris died on September 17th at 8:00. I was called for the next morning, and I was immediately worried. Whatever, I can't say it now. I just spent all this time writing it. I can't correcting it. I can't do it. But just the very opening is gripping to tell an audience from the beginning, a death has happened. And I'm worried about what will transpire. After he meets Poirot, he says, Shepard says, and by way of getting the audience on his side, I can't say that I saw everything that would transpire, but I knew there were thrilling times ahead. This idea that he's met Poirot and an incredible adventure is underway. And all at once it is, but it's just not quite the adventure that Shepard hoped would end the way it does, so to speak.
Absolutely. Well, you made reference to the fact that there obviously are a few previous adaptations of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. I wanted to touch on two of them. I'll start with the more recent of them. There is, of course, a David Suchet adaptation of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. It's, to be honest, I don't really think it's a fan favorite. It's not one of my favorites of the David Suchet series, which is such a brilliant series overall. It's not, and I don't think it's a bad adaptation, but I don't think that they really figured out how to preserve the narrative mechanism from the book in that adaptation. I'm curious if you're familiar with it, if you watched it or stayed away from it while you were writing your own adaptation, or just what your thoughts are on that adaptation.
Oh, I'm familiar with it. I think a quick Google search will find that you're quite right. It is not a fan favorite. A beloved series. I think it's one of those episodes that most people think misses the mark because it stayed away from the very thing that makes The Murder of Roger Ackroyd work in many ways. That said, there's some pretty fine performances in it, and there's the wonderful look of the series is sort of at its peak in that episode. I think there's a lot to commend in that regard, but it wasn't approached with the reverence for the source material in a way that I think people, it's a singular book that stands outside the canon in other way, because of Dr. Shepard. So they were up against it and how to approach it. And it just sort of didn't make it into that series in a way that many people feel was satisfactory, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that I believe I'm working off of my own hazy memory here, having now reviewed all of these titles. But I believe that was at the very beginning of the second iteration of the series when they were doing more filmic adaptation. Yeah. So I think that was probably their attempt where they said, well, and that's probably why they hadn't done it yet, because they knew that it was such to be such a thorny adaptation. So they did it proud in terms of production value and, the quality of acting, as they always do. But yeah, it felt a little bit like a miss, just because, well, it just wasn't even addressed. It's kind of like the elephant in the room the whole time. You're like, are we not going to talk about the whole narrator issue? So
well, the great thing though about adaptation is you kind of have to know your medium. So it's hard, I think, in film to do that piece. But as I say, with the theater, with a narrator inviting people in and being theatrical about how you tell the story, I think there is a bit of theater in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. And everyone is, of course, putting on a disguise or keeping it secret or trying to conceal something in which they act one way, but they really have a secret belief underneath it. And so the play is filled with people who are actors, who are sort of performing on some level. And so it seems easier, in fact, to embrace the idea of theater, of theatricality, and make it a play. And I think the cast enjoyed sort of investigating that as well.
That's really interesting. That is a fine distinction that I think I will buy. I think it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to do a film adaptation of the book, but theatrical adaptation, as proven by you and just as you've laid out, I think that it's eminently feasible. So yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't really differentiated the two of them, though.
There are a couple of other film versions of it. Or do you know of the Japanese version and the Russian version as well?
I do not. Tell us about the Japanese language.
I haven't seen them fully. I took a brief pass, a look at them. I think they're pretty good. I think they're really the look of them are terrific. The Japanese one is wonderfully at times over the top, from what I can tell, and kind of interesting. And although they take some license with the book, I think they are, from what I could tell, fairly faithful. I didn't want to get too involved in them, but both of them, if I'm not mistaken, I know the Japanese one for sure, it has a voiceover narration by the character who plays Dr. Shepard. And that seems to be the only way in, I suppose, unless you were really going to kind of embrace some address to camera or something. But it was kind of interesting to look briefly at those. I didn't, I only saw them way after I'd finished writing it, so it didn't have any hold on me in terms of how to study it. But I think there's room for a lot of different kinds of adaptations.
Yeah,
if you so desire.
Yeah. Voiceover is tough. I don't know. I mean, I know voiceover in a film to me just is so lacking compared to a first person narrator in a text. If it ain't Sunset Boulevard, I don't know when it works. This episode is sponsored by BritBox. We are hurtling into the holiday portion of the year, listeners, and no matter how you choose to celebrate or not, I would argue that BritBox is the perfect accompaniment for you. On BritBox, you'll find oodles of top-notch entertainment to cozy on up to, and not just Christie-related content. Have you checked out Stonehouse yet? If you are in withdrawal from Matthew McFadden now that Succession is over, and you've watched the 2005 Pride and Prejudice more times than you can count, then check out Stonehouse, a new original BritBox political thriller that Matthew McFadden is starring in which he fakes his own death. True story, but I own a miniature bust of Matthew McFadden as Darcy, so you know I'm in. Sign up for BritBox today and see why the New York Times calls it the best of British telly. I have a special limited time offer for my US and Canadian listeners. Get 50% off your first month when you sign up for a monthly plan, but only if you go to BritBox.com and use my promo code Agatha at checkout. So don't wait. Get 50% off your first month. Use promo code Agatha at BritBox.com. Well, I also wanted to touch on, of course, a much earlier, one of the very first, I believe the first major adaptation of any Christie, which would be Michael Morton's Alibi. That was his adaptation of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which first ran in 1928. It famously starred Charles Lawton as Poirot, and it was directed by Gerald du Maurier, father of Daphne, son of George. Yeah. So, very, very classic theatrical adaptation. Did you make yourself familiar with that one at all, or do you have a point of view on Alibi?
I had to say I had read it a number of years ago, well before I sat down to write it, and I didn't feel the need to write my adaptation. I didn't feel the need to revisit it, only because I know what it did, and I didn't think it had much to offer me to spur my imagination. It is sort of Roger Ackroyd in name only. There are characters who seem like Roger Ackroyd from my memory, from the book itself. I also know it eschews the very thing that makes Roger Ackroyd an interesting read, which is Shepard. I don't remember much of how it was handled, but I know that the characters seem somewhat different than the book, and Poirot seems very different. It is my understanding from reading not only Green's book, but many other things about it, that Christie herself was disenchanted with the idea of someone else adapting her work. And she so disliked Alibi that it gave her a little kick to say, maybe I'll try my hand at playwriting myself. And while Charles Lawton is an extraordinary actor, she thought and acknowledged that she thought he wasn't presenting the Poirot that she had written. that he was much more of a ladies' man, wanting to be called Beau Poirot, and all these stories around it. And it has a great distinction for giving Christie herself, I guess, some desire to be the playwright that we know and love and admire, because she wanted to try her hand at playwriting after seeing it. But it hasn't had the longevity or influence that either other adaptations or her own work ever did.
Yeah, and that's the adaptation that's notorious for making Caroline Shepherd younger and sexier. They aged her down and sexed her up.
Yeah, that's not good.
And
that's
she, and I mean, she had already written the Miss Marple short stories by then, but Murder at the Vicarage came out in 1930, and she claimed, and others claimed, that too may have been a little bit of a motivation, because Caroline Shepherd was one of the inspirations for Miss Marple, that, she figured, well, no, I want to preserve this character who I absolutely adore. And Caroline Shepherd is just one of the great characters of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, if not to your greatest, honestly,
To your point, I've often said, I feel like she's in some ways the heart of the book. If you look closely, everybody is telling a lie or concealing something in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, except in some fashion you can make a case, except for Caroline Shepherd, who is derided sometimes as a gossip for trying to reveal the truth. And she's delightful and charming and has her network of people in town, from the postal clerk to the maids and other people in town whom she does gossip with, but she's in search of the truth. And she is wonderful in the book. She's one of the great creations. And you do worry for her at the end of the book in some regard when you realize that Shepherd has done something devious. And what would his sister think, because she's such a lovable character.
Yeah.
So I think Caroline Shepherd is a remarkable creation of Christie's, and I loved putting her on the stage and trying to help define her voice for the theater.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems to me that Alibi has the same sort of a miss that the David Suchet version does, which is that there's just they don't deal with the narration issue. And, to my mind, if you're not going to go there, it makes an adaptation of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd feel a little irrelevant. And that's why I was so excited when I heard about yours. And I can't wait to see it wherever or however I can. I hope that. I encourage people to go to the Alley Theater in Houston. I know it's playing right now.
It is. I think curtain is in about 10 minutes. So, yeah.
But I hope that it plays elsewhere and others can
We're planning on it. Yeah. Hoping that it'll come to a theater near you, as they say. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, the other thing that we should make clear is that Poirot is a character in your adaptation.
Absolutely.
You, unlike Agatha Christie, did not write Poirot out of this adaptation of a Poirot story. We, of course, know that Christie did exactly that. Other than Wasp's Nest, which was a short little adaptation that she did of a Poirot short story. And of course, she wrote the original play Black Coffee, which features Poirot. But otherwise, it seems that she found his flamboyance and eccentricity, perhaps especially when played by scenery-chewing actors like Charles Laughton and Francis L. Sullivan. She found it to detract from the investigatory process that's required in a whodunit. He was a distraction, in other words. That's something that I talked a little bit about with Julius Green recently. And I was interested to see that you chose to keep Poirot in your adaptation. So how do you deal with this issue, or do you even agree that it is an issue?
Well, there's a number of ways to answer that or to think about it. One is that I happen to be a big fan of the play Black Coffee. I've seen it performed, and I think Poirot's entrance in Black Coffee is fascinating. A murder happens, the lights go out, and when they come back up shortly after the doors open, and he comes in and says, "I'm Hercule Poirot," and you can't help but want to applaud. But it's something kind of mystical about that entrance. There's something remarkable about the way she constructed the play and allowed him on stage. I understand why perhaps Christie didn't love putting him on stage, because perhaps he ate up so much oxygen and her characters needed to thrive in other ways. In your wonderful conversation with Mr. Green, who wrote that terrific book, Curtain Up, which I tried to be a student of, I really enjoyed reading it. There's that love-hate relationship that Christie had with her own creation. And she was happy to leave him out of Witness for the Prosecution and The Mousetrap and other pieces, and all these other characters came in. One of the joys of a Christie piece of theater is that parade of characters who come in and drop little things about their backstories, and we enjoy watching them come in most wonderfully in things like "And Then There Were None" or "The Mousetrap." I just love all of that. But you both mentioned on that interview I listened to that you had that a modern audience really wants desperately to see Poirot on a stage. They want to visit with a character they love. And you guys were joking, saying, I think that there would be a riot on Shaftesbury Avenue if they, if you did a Christie about a Poirot and Poirot wasn't in it. And I feel particularly interested in saying that Poirot doesn't come in till a bit later in the Murder of Roger Ackroyd, but he is integral to the piece in so many ways. It's so interesting that Poirot says he is retired, right? It's 1926. He's retired to King's Abbot. He goes on well into the 1970s, so that tells you how old he would be. But that he is, he's arrived at some place where a murder has happened, and Dr. Shepard, unfortunately, has had the experience of having the greatest detective move in next door at the time where he plans to commit a murder. To put that on stage, I thought there would be something really kind of great about how we perceive Poirot as the outsider. I love Christie's descriptions of Poirot, of that speck of dust that would drive him mad, or the way in which he is fastidious, but to some extent, he lets people misjudge him as being an outsider. And he puts on a bit of an act, all of the mustache and the look and the hair and the outfit. There is a construction in Poirot that's very theatrical and interesting. And people tell him things because sometimes they don't quite understand who he is, I think, in the books. And in the book, in Ackroyd, he is introduced when he throws his vegetable marrows over the hedge from his garden into Dr. Shepard's. And I thought it'd be really interesting if in the beginning, while Shepard introduces himself, suddenly these vegetable marrows landed from off stage on stage. And Shepard had to look into the wings to say, yes, there's also this incredible character you're about to meet. And then Poirot comes on. And to me, in some regard, it feels like Poirot, even though he knows that he's in the wings, he interrupts the play to say, just so you know, I'm here until the going gets good. And then we go off and we have Roger get murdered and we meet all the other characters. And then Poirot comes back and he says in that wonderful vampiric line, I'm happy to take this case. If you want to know all the truth, are you sure you want to know it? And Laura Ackroyd says, yes, I want all the truth. It's all of it. Yes, all of it. Then I accept. He's invited into the story and then he takes over. Right. So at the top of the first act, I have Shepard narrating. And at the top of the second act, I wanted it to be clear that Poirot has taken it over. And there's a wonderful passage, if you remember, I don't know, Kemper, if you remember, it's in the book, where Poirot is at the Mahjong game with some locals, and the conversation just turns to murder and why people might commit murder. And there's this brief treatise from Poirot on that there is a strain of madness inside all of us that could lead to murder, or a dark side to it, rather. And it's this great bit of writing. And I thought, what if the play suddenly opened with all the characters in the shadows on stage and Poirot addressing the audience and I've had to alter it a little bit just to make it the text briefer and perhaps a little easier in the mouth for the actor, but to address the audience, to say, I know you're out there and you're watching this. By the end of this act, this is act 2, we're going to rock your world. But think about the person next to you, to your left and right. They might be holding a secret too. And that helps make it a little bit theatrical as well. Poirot seems indispensable to the Murder of Roger Ackroyd because of who he is and what he means in the center of the story as this sort of fly in the ointment of this little town that gets upset. And he comes in as the outsider and sees it all.
Yeah, I feel like the calculus of that decision, whether or not to excise Poirot from the play, has just changed. And it's kind of a no-brainer that I think you want to preserve him. And it also strikes me that, Agatha Christie can stand firm on that decision. And she did in her career as a playwright. And she said, no, I don't want him in there. And that's my decision. But that's the decision of the person who created the underlying material. And that's a very different thing from adapting, and especially adapting now too. I mean, you're adapting in the shadow of this 100+ storied career, and Poirot is just there from beginning to end. And it's just a different decision-making process. And I completely understand why you kept him in, and I'm happy you did.
And not for nothing. If someone doing an adaptation wants to honor the author and not change the author, the author's intent to some extent. You can smuggle in your own point of view or update something that might seem unpalatable, or condense things and make sure that the play works theatrically in a way that perhaps it needs to alter from a novel. But you also want to honor the book as when you're adapting something. Mm-hmm. Christie, of course, was in her own driver's seat to say, I'm not adapting, I'm creating something new based on something I've already considered. So she was, her sense of creativity was tuned into something altogether remarkable and different.
Right. You mentioned this a little earlier in our conversation, but I believe that you've directed a few plays that Christie wrote herself, including Witness for the Prosecution and The Hollow. I'd love to hear about those. And also just in general, I'd love to know whether as a theater professional and Christie addict, you have a favorite Agatha Christie play, a favorite play that she herself wrote.
I appreciate that question. That's a hard one for me. I spent a lot of time both as a director and a writer, but also as an actor. Been happy to perform on stages around the country and in New York. At the Alley, I acted in Witness for the Prosecution as well as The Hollow, and I've done And Then There Were None. And I will tell you, The Hollow is not done as often, and it's really a fantastic play. The character study in The Hollow is really, really terrific. It's a long play, and I wondered if the audience would stay with it. Mm-hmm. And at the end, this wonderful, wonderful ending that Christie sort of constructs, audiences were not only still with it, they were vocal as certain events happened. You could hear them in the audience sort of speaking out. And I thought it was just a fantastic play. Somewhere along the line, I know I played John Christo in that one, the guy who gets killed. So I call it a crossword.
Yeah.
I call it a crossword puzzle role, meaning I'm in there for like 45 minutes and then I get murdered. And then I go to the dressing room and I listen to the play every night while doing a crossword puzzle until they're But I would actually stand in the wings and watch it often. It was great. When I did Witness for the Prosecution, I was playing Leonard Vole, the fellow who goes on trial for the murder of Miss French. The production was fantastic. It was at the Alley. It was a gorgeous set. Everything about it just works like gangbusters, that play. And to stand inside that play, I think it is my favorite of her plays because I remember distinctly the first time going out there in front of a preview audience and thinking, this is a different kind of quietness than you're used to hearing in the theater. Not a rustle, not a cough, not a sniffle. That audience wanted to make sure they didn't miss anything. That the laughter, because there were some wonderful little jokes in the beginning of Witness for the Prosecution, and the laughter seemed abrupt. They'd go, they didn't want to miss a thing. So there was a brittleness to the audience in many ways. And they respond to that play like listeners, like real active participants in the proceedings, especially during the trial scenes of that play. Person after person, another great parade, right, comes out and gives their testimony in the courtroom. And all of these facts are interesting, but some of them are pertaining to the case, and some of them slip in interesting little tidbits that if you're not paying attention might become important later on. But every one of those well-defined characters who takes the stand to give their testimony is a little piece of theater in and of themselves. And it's a fantastic second act in particular. Mm-hmm. The end of the play has the most tremendous triple Lutz ending of all time. Christie writes in, three endings, essentially, three ways to finish the play, if you will. It's like, if you didn't like one, stick around 2 pages, there's another one coming up. And the audience was vocal about each one of them. And those last few minutes of the play have been so expertly built up that by the end of the play, if you don't have them, if you haven't built it properly, it's just a remarkable thing to hear an audience go along for that ride and arrive at this sort of extraordinary ending of Witness for the Prosecution. Last year, I was in London. I was directing the play I wrote, A Sherlock Carol, for its London premiere. And I was there for about 6 weeks. And I'm not embarrassed to tell you, I made my pilgrimage to see The Mousetrap again. I made my pilgrimage to see Witness for the Prosecution. In fact, I might even have seen it twice, if I'm willing to admit that. And I thought it's a tremendous production. I loved it. I thought it was really wonderful. It's playing over there now. And the actors were terrific. It was staged beautifully. And I was just amazed by, once again, sometimes you can sort of, as a director, I like to sort of look at the audience sometimes while watching a play to see how they're receiving it. And people are leaning forward and gasping, and their mouths are open at the end of Witness for the Prosecution. And it is such a great thing to see how well constructed a play can be, and when delivered properly. And I just love that play. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, I think Julie Screen counts 4 twists at the end of it, which
4. I'm calling 3, but I like your
no.
4,
But
okay.
I kind of thought 3 as well. And when I read that, I was like, I'm going to have to count those up the next time I watch it. And I think the next time I'm in England, I'm going to try to see it because I haven't seen that production of it yet, and I've heard now from numerous people that it's a quite good one. So
it's really good. Yeah, and I thought the cast I saw. I know they've had several iterations as this long running now, but the cast I saw was terrific. It always bothers me a little bit sometimes with murder mysteries, because I love doing them. I love doing Frederick Knott. I've done Dial In for Murder, and I love doing them. But sometimes in the theater, people think that, I don't know, you knock on the door of making a spoof of it because the genre is so well known, particularly in the older plays. And if you play it up like it's a spoof, well, that's okay, but then you're doing Clue, and that's fine too, because there's a place for Clue and a place for spoofs. But I thought that, I like it when these Christie plays, which sometimes have a lot of light comedy in them, are also able to vacillate between the darker themes and the drawing room comedy that sometimes you're just really good at, And those two things can exist simultaneously if you're careful and hold the line and allow it to be silly and fun sometimes, but also veer back to the darker themes. I think that production of Witness of the Prosecution, there was a lot to study in it, and I thought it was terrific. And I kept it in mind as I was directing The Murder of Roger Ackroyd at the Alley.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and that's what Christie does in all of her books. I mean, she so often goes light and she goes dark. And in almost all of them, she pulls off a satisfyingly clued puzzle mystery on top of that. And that is so often what I think is dispensed with in the more spoofy fare that's still adjacent to the murder mystery genre, because it's hard. It's hard to do. God. It's very plotty, and you have to, it requires a lot of machinations that in less skillful hands get in the way of character. Right. But if you can pull it off, what that means is that it's a feast, right? Like it's a feast for the audience. And it's just, that's why people go to see Agatha Christie plays or true murder mystery plays, because they know that if it is all working, you're getting a lot. You're getting a lot of bang for your buck, right? And that's powerful.
I brought my daughter when I was in London. She came over. My wife and daughter came over, and I brought my daughter, who was 12 at the time. She's now 13, to see The Mousetrap. And she did not know. She had never seen it. Didn't know how it ended. And I thought, I wonder if she'll guess it. I had all the thoughts about it. And I was really interested in watching a 12-year-old watch it. And she would slap my thigh right before something terrifying happened. Or, I don't want to spoil it for I'm sure everyone on your podcast list. But at the end of, the first act, the curtain comes down, and she was, hitting me in the arm going, oh my gosh, excited by it. And I thought it's remarkable. I know that in your previous podcast, you were talking about how the Mousetrap in London is like an institution. It's a bit almost like a museum piece or something. And that might be true to some extent for the tourist trade. But once you get in the doors, yes, it is sort of, the theater on Martin's Lane is a place where you go to make it sort of a pilgrimage, if you will, to this Christie stuff. But it is also a wonderful play. It reminded me what a wonderful play it is. And I've seen a lot of productions of the Mousetrap, and I've done it. It can be handled in a number of ways. And that the plays are also malleable that way. And I think that's sort of fascinating too.
Yeah. I mean, it's even though it functions as this sort of museum piece or pilgrimage is a better way to put it. I think it really is. It's like on one of those, you have to tick the box. It's like, did you see the Mousetrap? Did you go to Big Ben? Did you see the Crown Jewels? Did you watch the Mousetrap? It's just become that, that much of a tradition, but it's still a play.
I know.
Play works.
Isn't that wonderful? And you're reminded of that when you go there. You thought it was something you had to do. It's not quite like going to Harrods or I'm born and bred a New Yorker, and I think I was 35 years old before I went up to the top of the Empire State Building. Things that people come to do. I've never done when you live there, but there's a wonderful sense of making that part of going to London if you are there. And for that matter, if you see an Agatha Christie in the United States, like I did as a boy, it is a way of transporting yourself to this other world. It always feels a little, I've heard people talk about it, that sometimes you can't necessarily place the decade in which a Christie is because it happens in Agatha Christie time, if you will, that it's, the plays don't often directly talk about the wars or anything that was going on in the world directly, but it's there. And yet she creates a world which can be re-envisioned, reimagined, and still feel current, even though it's set in some nostalgic past now that it wasn't back when the plays were written. Mm-hmm. So there's become this added sort of vintage quality to these plays. And I feel it's wonderful that they don't really exist in a real England, if you will, in some regard. They exist in her version of a world that she has created for us to visit, based on, as we all know from reading her biography, on her upbringing and her influences and England in the 20th century and what it was going through as well. But there is a creation now, a nostalgic creation when you go see a Christie.
That's really interesting, because I think I've never thought about that, because, one of the surprising things I think that most people encounter when they actually do engage with Christie's texts are that not every book, but so many of the books really are tethered to a specific place and time, and especially time, right? Where you're like, oh, these are the books that are immediately after World War II, because you have rationing and they feel different, and there's the trauma of the war, and you can feel the books that are set in the 30s, and then you can certainly feel the books that are set in the late 60s for a lot of different reasons. And
absolutely with those, you're right. Well, maybe I'm jumping the gun and saying it, because you're absolutely right about those things. I mean, even in Witness for the Prosecution, I'm talking, Vole talks about having been in the war. But, there's not a definitive strike or stance about the war is what I'm saying. Like these plays happen in her version of the world, if you will. And that's something that I've always found kind of intriguing, if you will. She creates a world for us.
No, but I think that's absolutely true. And, I honestly, you can speak more to it than I can, because I am not as much of a scholar of the texts of the plays as I am the texts of the novels. But from what I can remember of the plays that I've read thus far, because I've covered a number of them for the podcast Patreon account at this point, and they're not, I don't think they are as tethered to a specific time and place, because she was doing something a little different, I think, when she was writing the plays as opposed to writing the novels. And I know, at least in the case of And Then There Were None, she quite famously or infamously changed the ending of that one, right, and made it happy. But that was because it was being put on in the midst of World War II, when she almost kind of wanted to create the negative of what was happening, and that was sort of a secondary purpose, I think, of putting on that play. So I think there are different motivations that she had as a playwright as opposed to as a novelist.
Well, you put me in I probably should think this through before I speak about it, because you jog my memory here a little bit. There's some interesting things in the plays that do tether it to certain aspects of the 20th century. The Mousetrap, and particularly I'm thinking about her use of technology. The Mousetrap has this wonderful runner of a radio announcement about the murderer who's on the loose, and what the murderer might be wearing, as the characters are holding a hat and a scarf and a jacket, and we kind of recognize that what's on the radio is what we're looking at. Even in the book, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, that's the 20s, and it relies heavily on telephone calls. It relies on a telegram. It relies on a dictaphone. Mm-hmm. That what seems like archaic technology to us now was sort of modern in its way when the book came out. I even love the use of a recording And Then There Were None. All of these plays have theatrical opportunities found in the novels for the way in which the world was changing, or the way in which technology was coming in, even in how there's a sense of what it means to be international in that regard. That's sort of fascinating too, because even as I find them nostalgic, it's fun to remember that they were really modern when they came out as well.
Absolutely. Well, and my takeaway from your answer as to the plays is that I think The Hollow needs to be performed a lot more than it is.
I agree.
Witness for the Prosecution, The Mousetrap, even, some of the lighter ones like Spider's Web.
Spider's Web is great. Spider's Web is great.
It's wonderful. We know about all of those, but The Hollow, I think, doesn't get all that much notice.
A number of years ago, I was directing a production of Noel Coward's Hay Fever. And I was suddenly, while doing it, I was like, The Hollow feels like a Noel Coward play where a murder happens in the middle of it. All these wonderful people showing up at a country home, having this witty banter, not expecting a murder. And then I thought, what Hay Fever's missing is a good old fashioned murder. I wouldn't presume to tell the Coward fans that, though.
No, I think that, and in the same way that, sometimes you can argue that there's a little bit of P.G. Wodehouse, especially in lighter and sprightlier Christie novels. I think there absolutely is a little bit of Noel Coward in some of Christie, as crazy as that might sound. I think that's
it's a scholarly stretch, but you can see the tenuous connection. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
in some regards. Are you aware of the Orson Welles radio version of Ackroyd as well? I wanted to ask you about that.
I'm not. No, please tell us about that.
Oh yeah, you immediately got to link it on your. You just got to get off when you get off with me and listen to it. It's a riot. It's Campbell Playhouse, which was what he did War of the Worlds on, and when he was in his radio heyday. He did the Murder of Roger Ackroyd in 1 hour, and he plays both Poirot and Shepard. And most of the novel is excised because the only really interesting thing in it is the fact that it's Orson Welles doing both characters, and it's Welles being Welles, in his gargantuan persona. And it's really enjoyable in its own way, particularly if you're a fan, as I am, of Welles by way of Christie. And to hear his voice intoning the character of Poirot is something of a ludicrous riot, but it's great anyway. A lot of the book has been excised just to get to the beginning and the end. The middle of it is mostly disappeared, but it's really fun. It's worth to listen to. It's really fun.
Well, you know what? If I can find that link, I'm going to include that link in.
Oh, it's all over YouTube. You can find it. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I will include that link, listeners, for you.
You'll get it. In
the notes.
You'll get a kick out of it. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite Agatha Christie novel?
Well, And Then There Were None is one of those books that also captivated me when I was a young reader.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's probably one of my favorites of all time. But I also have a few others that, and some of the short stories, but also I love the ABC Murders, but I also remember reading at Bertram's Hotel and loving that as well. I remember reading it at Brown's Hotel, actually, just in the lobby of it, just to get a full experience. But there's some books, I don't know if you feel the same way, where I care less about who done it than I care about the characters in peril and the puzzle itself. And I have a great love for that. And I feel that way about The Mirror Cracked as well. They're wonderful characters to sort of visit. And although the puzzles are intricate and beautifully put together, and she has to have them in order to deliver us to a satisfying conclusion, sometimes, and as satisfactory as they are, sometimes I actually am more intrigued by visiting the characters that she creates than the puzzles themselves, if that makes sense.
Couldn't agree more. That's how I feel about Nemesis, actually. If you're listening to this, John Curran, and I know you are, John Curran and I have our long-going feud over Nemesis, long simmering feud now. But I mean, and the puzzle on that one is actually not one of Christie's best by any means, but when it comes to the characters and the character work that she's doing there.
Do you mind if I interview you? Can I interview you?
Please.
Right? Where do you stand on Evil Under the Sun?
I love Evil Under the Sun, actually. I think it's one of the most Christie-esque books that she wrote. It's like Evil Under the Sun is a book that I would recommend as one of the first books to someone who hasn't read Christie. If not, maybe like The Body in the Library is one that I have recommended before because it's so quick and it's just also doing a lot. But it's almost like that's the Poirot parallel. Like I think Evil Under the Sun gives a good sense of what Agatha Christie does at her best.
I love it. I can't believe I didn't say this when you asked me. I had a different answer for what one of my favorites is, which is I love 3-act tragedy or Murder in 3 Acts quite a bit, mostly because it includes theater people. Probably.
I was just going to say one of the most, stagey of her books. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah. What was I thinking? Why didn't I adapt that one? I do love it. I won't spoil it, obviously, but the actual puzzle is rooted in theater. And that's why I found it's this like perfect marriage of form and content, as they say. There's something theatrical about the murder itself. And that's a book where the parade of characters is just fantastic. They're terrific.
Yes,
all of them, and the locations are as well.
Yeah,
it's so terrific. Give me another one. Give me what's your other highest on your list?
Oh, Five
'Cause I've
Five
heard
Little
you-
Pigs is our top
Five Little
rated.
Pigs. Yeah,
Yeah.
I got it. That's your number one.
It's our number one.
Death in the Clouds. Where do you stand on Death in the Clouds?
Death in the Clouds, I'm a little less
Interesting.
enthused about that one, actually.
It's a good goose, though, isn't it? I mean, it's a good murder. Good.
I mean, they all. That's the thing. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
God, you're so fine parsing these things. It just becomes an insane exercise, which is, you know, why this podcast exists. But
that's right. Do you ever? It's like listening to the Beatles. You listen to a song, you're like, "That's the greatest song ever," and then you go to the next song, you think that's the greatest song ever. So my opinion will change according to what I'm reading sometimes. Well, you're an author. You're a mystery author, and you know, I look forward to reading your book. And it's funny because you feel the influence. I loved your interview with Ruth Ware. I'm a huge Ruth Ware fan. I've just cracked open her latest, and I love to read those books because you can feel the influence still lingering in there, even as authors reinvent or adapt to the modern sensibilities of writing and publishing. But Absolutely. You can still feel Christie in the DNA of the genre. The way you can feel Conan Doyle and even, you know, Edgar Allan Poe in the DNA of Sherlock Holmes stories or Conan Doyle and Christie stories. So it's such a wonderful thing to be a fan of a genre that the more you dig deeper into it, it's so satisfying to see the lineage and how it continues on in that regard.
It's true.
You know, that's what I hope. Yeah, that's what I hope people feel about seeing our play. If Roger Ackroyd, to say Christie wrote those wonderful plays, that you're honoring it but trying to do something new with it, because there's nothing wrong with changing as the world and times change and theater changes, but it still has Christie at its heart. But you know, publishing is a different world, obviously. But you must feel it as you set pen to paper all the time.
You know, I mean, I think the deeper that one reads in the mystery genre, I'd say, you know, you start seeing all of these interconnections, and I'm sure this is the case for every genre, right? But because people influence, you know, other authors influence other authors, but it's really interesting to see that. And yeah, the Conan Doyle, even in Christie, and like you said, Poe and Conan Doyle, and it's all, you know, and it goes back. I love that too. I'm not going to let you go though without asking you the age-old difficult question. This is going to be my final question, Mark, which is gun to head, Poirot or Marple? I think I know your answer here.
What if I threw you for a loop? Because you asked me what my favorite Christie, and it's funny, although I should have said 3-Act Tragedy, I said, and then there were none. I also loved the one-offs. I think, you know who the star is? It's Agatha Christie. It's not Poirot and it's not Marple. I'm a Christie fan, you know. I admire her, and as a theater maker, when I look at her, the well-constructed plays, and think, how does she do it? I think I go to the altar of Agatha Christie before I even bother to think about Poirot or Marple. Obviously, I would probably go to Poirot as my favorite detective in that regard, but I do love a good Miss Marple. So, and I'm sort of fascinated by the character. But you know, as I say, I think it's Christie that I revere. Listen, I'm about to embark on this journey being the artistic director of a wonderful 94-year-old theater in Connecticut. And in recent years, it has been hard to get audiences to come back to the theater after the pandemic. And I mean, there's so many challenges. We read about theaters closing up shop all the time. And we ask ourselves at meetings, what do audiences want to see? How can we stay current while also serving what's come before? And when we did our reading of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd the week before I went into production with it at the Alley, at the Westport Country Playhouse, we did this reading. I announced it in one night and it sold out almost immediately. Audiences will tell you, we want to go to that. Every night I get a performance report. I'm up in Massachusetts right now with my family, and I get my performance report of what's going on at the Alley. And the numbers are great. The audiences are back. They're coming to it. They're coming to it because it's called Agatha Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. They know that Christie will serve up a wonderful story with great characters. And, you know, although the world has changed and certain things about Christie, I loved listening to your podcast about, you know, reservations about language being changed and things like that. Even Christie's titles adapted in her lifetime, and things are changing. But at the core of what she wrote, I hope our play honors that while making something fresh and new. And I feel that the audiences are getting something brand new and looking forward, even as they're embracing something that they think they know and that honors what came before us in Christie's theater world. Agatha Christie is helping bring people into the doors and back in the seats. And I think seems to have been gone a long time, but she's very present in what we're all doing and at the Alley Theater right now in getting audiences to return. And I'm grateful to her.
Well, I'm taking your answer as Poirot, just so you know, because I don't let anyone shirk that,
okay,
that
I'll
question.
Give you that. Yeah, bro, I was trying to be poetic and give you a fancy answer, just
and I just rejected it all.
Yeah,
no, that is.
So I think you should edit all that out and just say Poirot. You're right.
I won't. No, that's a very poetic answer, and I appreciate that. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's not just through the mousetrap, but I've said this so many times now on the podcast, but I have such an appreciation for how many regional and amateur productions of Agatha Christie's plays are being done all the time, like literally multiple productions every day of the year. And it remains a really important way by which people know Agatha Christie and get to know theater. I think she is, in the same way that people become readers through Agatha Christie when they're younger. I think a lot of people become theater goers through Agatha Christie as well. So,
absolutely. It happened to me, but I also, we in the theater sometimes say people come to A Christmas Carol or they come to the murder mystery. Some of those people are young people and they might fall in love with going to the theater and make it a practice in their life. They might even end up making plays. They also might recommend plays, and it could influence them when they see what's possible creatively. And so, I love the fact that I think our play, I love to watch people bring kids to see the play down at the alley and think of it as a gateway influence into enjoying the theater. And Christie is great for that. I mean, she's still bringing them in and giving us what we want, even as the world changes and even the plays adapt. And she'll be doing that long after you and I are gone, Yep. These plays will still be done in one form or another. Absolutely.
Agatha Christie, the most beneficial gateway drug for reading and theater going and all sorts of great things. Well, Mark, this was an absolute pleasure. I really mean it when I say I cannot wait to see your adaptation of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd somewhere in some form. And obviously, I encourage other people to do the same, especially if you are down in Texas right now. And thank you so much for coming on and giving us your time.
It's a great honor to be on your podcast because I love listening to it and love your passion for it. And I'm grateful to have the spot on the street with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Mark Shanahan for sitting down with me and having such a fascinating discussion about The Murder of Roger Ackroyd specifically and adaptation generally. I thought he had so many interesting insights into the process of adapting a novel like The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, a tricky novel, into a play. You could really tell he's thought long and hard about this process, and I love that he shared a little bit of that process with us. I thought it was such an interesting conversation. I have duly included a link to that Orson Welles radio adaptation of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd for your listening pleasure. Mark had such a deep knowledge of the Roger Ackroyd adaptations out there, so I'm thrilled to be able to share yet another Roger Ackroyd adaptation with you, for free, no less, through the magic of YouTube. That link is in the show notes to this episode. For my next episode, oh happy day, it is time to have Sophie Hannah back on the podcast, but not to speak about her latest Poirot novel, Hercule Poirot's Silent Night. That's her Christmas-themed Poirot that just came out in time for this holiday season. Oh no, we are going to be talking to Sophie about her musical play turned musical film, The Mystery of Mr. E. So this will be another theater-focused or theater-adjacent episode. I love that we're doing so many of these. I'm really on a theater kick here, if you can't tell. There will be more theater-based episodes in the months to come. Until then, you can always check out the podcast's bonus content over on the Patreon site, www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha, or just click the link in the notes to this episode. I'll be putting out the podcast's annual Christmas-themed episode in December, where I'll be reviewing a couple of Christmas-themed short story murder mysteries. That holiday episode is always a lot of fun. Specifically, I'll be covering a story by Colin Dexter. That's right, an Inspector Morse Christmas story. Quite a lovely Inspector Morse Christmas story, in fact, as well as one by Marjorie Allingham. I have not talked nearly enough about Marjorie Allingham on this podcast or even on the Patreon episodes, so I can't wait to give her and her creation, Albert Campion, a little bit of love. You can always email me, of course, at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. And you can find the podcast on Twitter at All About the Dame and on Instagram at All About Agatha. You can find me on Facebook at Kemper Donovan Books. And I have provided links in the notes to this episode for the easy pre-ordering of my upcoming mystery novel, The Busybody. You can order that in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Australia and New Zealand. Please take a moment to give the podcast a rating and or a review if you haven't yet done so. It really does help the podcast out. It's much appreciated. And I'll see you next time. Happy Thanksgiving. Bye.
You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.